The news arrived on a salt-laced wind, carried by a panting courier whose face was pale with the dust of the Via Egnatia and the gravity of his message. In the quiet coastal city of Apollonia, Gaius Octavius, a student of rhetoric and philosophy, was reading a scroll from his tutor when the world tilted on its axis. Caesar was dead, assassinated, stabbed 23 times by men he had called his friends, on the floor of a senate that bore his name. His friends, the stoic Agrippa and the urbane Maecenas, gathered around him in the courtyard, their youthful faces a mixture of shock and fear. They spoke in hushed, urgent tones, the words tumbling over one another. "This is a death sentence," Agrippa warned, his hand instinctively resting on the hilt of his training sword. He was a soldier at heart, and he saw the world in terms of threats. They killed the great Caesar. What will they do to his heir? Maecenas, ever the pragmatist, advised a different kind of caution. Go to ground. Vanish. Let the storm pass. Rome is a vortex of knives and ambition right now, and you are but a sapling. But Octavius heard them as if from a great distance. The scroll in his hand felt impossibly heavy. It was not just the death of his great uncle, the man who had plucked him from relative obscurity. It was the will. He had been named Caesar's son, his heir, the name, the power, the immense fortune, and with them, an ocean of enemies. It was all his, a poisoned chalice offered by a dead man's hand. He looked out at the Adriatic, its waves churning grey and indifferent. He was 18, frail, prone to illness. He was, in the eyes of the giants who strode through Rome, nothing. But Caesar had chosen him. He saw the path fork before him with terrifying clarity, a long, safe life of anonymity, fading back into the comfortable equestrian class from which he came, or a short, violent one, grasping at a legacy that could consume him whole. The silence stretched. His friends watched him, holding their breath, waiting for the boy they knew to make a decision. But the boyish softness in his face seemed to recede, burned away by an internal fire, then cooled into something hard and still. "We sail for Italy," he said, his voice quiet, yet devoid of any doubt. It was the voice of a stranger. "I am accepting my inheritance." He landed at Lupiae, a small port in southern Italy, deliberately avoiding the main harbour of Brundisium, where Antony's legions were quartered. He did not come as a frightened boy seeking safety, but as a claimant making a statement. The first act of his new life was a declaration. Standing before the small crowd of local dignitaries and curious fishermen that had gathered, he formally accepted the terms of Caesar's will. He was no longer Gaius Octavius. He was, he declared in a clear voice, Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. The name was magic. It was a key that unlocked the hearts of Caesar's veterans, men who had been settled on lands throughout Italy, and now felt orphaned and betrayed by the Senate's amnesty for the assassins. As he travelled north on the Appian Way, his procession grew. Old centurions with scarred faces, grizzled legionaries who had fought for Caesar in Gaul and Britain and Africa, flocked to his banner. They saw in his youthful, determined face the echo of their murdered general. He did not have an army, but Caesar's name was an army. He used the vast personal fortune left to him, a war chest beyond imagining, to offer each man a bounty, sealing their loyalty, not just with sentiment, but with cold, hard gold. It was an illegal act, the raising of a private army. It was treason. But in the power vacuum of Rome, legality was a luxury afforded only to the weak. Power was the only truth that mattered. Rome was a city holding its breath. The air in the forum was thick with rumor, fear, and the sweat of political maneuvering. It was here, in the house of the man who now held the city in his grasp, that the first true test occurred. Mark Antony was a man forged in battle and politics, a lion of a man whose charisma was as potent as his ambition. He received Octavian not as a bereaved nephew or a political equal, but as a presumptuous child interrupting the business of great men. Antony was reclining on a couch, a wine cup in hand, surrounded by his loyalists and military officers. He did not rise. "The boy," he said, his voice laced with a lazy amusement that was more insulting than open contempt. "Come for your pocket money, have you?" The men around him chuckled dutifully. Octavian stood before him, slight and unassuming in his simple toga. He did not rise to the bait. He spoke with a calm, measured tone that seemed unnatural in one so young, demanding the money from Caesar's estate to pay the legacies promised to the Roman people in the will. "It is my duty," Octavian said, his gaze steady, "to fulfill my father's promises to his people." Antony waved a dismissive hand. "The state has absorbed those funds for the good of the Republic, of course." He looked Octavian up and down, a predator sizing up prey that was hardly worth the effort of a chase. "You are playing a dangerous game, child. Go back to your books. Rome is no place for you." Octavian's eyes were cold, chips of ice. He did not raise his voice. He simply held Antony's gaze. "The people of Rome will receive what is theirs. My father's will shall be honored." He turned and walked away, the silence in his wake more powerful and unnerving than any shouted threat. The lion had roared, but the serpent had not flinched. It had merely taken measure of its opponent. Octavian left Antony's villa, knowing that words, duty, and sentiment would not move the man. Antony had the loyalty of the legions, the official power of the state. But loyalty, Octavian understood, was a commodity. It had a price. He met with agents in secret, men who knew the talk in the barracks and the grievances of the soldiers. He learned that two of Antony's most elite legions, the Martian and the Fourth, were restive. They had been loyal to Caesar, and they felt Antony had not done enough to avenge him, too quick to make deals with the Senate. Octavian didn't offer them glory or speeches about the Republic. He offered them cash, a staggering sum, far more than Antony was willing or able to pay, delivered directly from his inheritance. He dispatched his agents with chests of gold, and the transaction was as simple as any market deal. The loyalty of two of the finest legions in the Roman army was purchased. When the news reached Antony that the Martian and the Fourth had defected and sworn a new oath to the boy Caesar, his fury was volcanic. He had been outmaneuvered, not by a general or a politician, but by an accountant. Octavian had not won a battle, he had won a bid, and in doing so, he had transformed himself from a political nuisance into a mortal threat. The old orator, Marcus Tullius Cicero, saw a weapon in the slight frame of this young Caesar, this boy who had appeared from nowhere with legions at his back. He perceived a tool sharp enough to excise the tumor that was Mark Antony. He summoned Octavian to his grand villa on the Palatine Hill, the air thick with the scent of aged parchment and political calculation. Cicero spoke of the Republic, of liberty, of the sacred traditions Antony had defiled. His voice was a magnificent instrument, honed by decades of senatorial combat. The Senate will grant you pro praetorian imperium, Cicero declared, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of his own cleverness. Your command will be made legal. You will be the Republic's shield, leading our legions alongside the newly elected consuls Hirtius and Pansa against the traitor Antony. Octavian listened, his expression one of earnest deference. He played the part of the dutiful son eager to serve the state that his divine father had, in his own way, also served. He thanked Cicero profusely for his wisdom and his patronage. But behind the mask of youthful sincerity, a cold calculus was at work. Cicero saw a pawn, a temporary counterbalance to be discarded once Antony was dealt with. Octavian saw a ladder. The Senate was giving him the legal authority to command the very army they feared, all in the name of destroying their mutual enemy. He would be their weapon for now, and a weapon, once forged, can be pointed in any direction. The Battle of Mutina was a bloody, chaotic affair in the damp plains of northern Italy. The combined forces of the Republic, led by the two consuls Hirtius and Pansa, along with Octavian's legions, clashed with Antony's hardened veterans. Octavian, however, was not on the front lines. A sudden illness, his physicians announced, had confined him to his tent. While other men fought and died in the mud and the blood, he was conspicuously absent. His personal guard fought bravely, and he was said to have been swept up in the fighting near his camp, but the glory of the day belonged to others. Antony was defeated and driven back across the Alps, but at a terrible cost. Pansa was mortally wounded in the fighting. Hirtius, in a cruel twist of fate, was killed in the confused aftermath while storming Antony's camp. The victory belonged to the Republic, but its two chief magistrates were dead. News of the consuls' deaths reached Octavian in his tent. Agrippa delivered the report, his face grim. A victory, but a costly one. Octavian's expression was unreadable. Two consuls, both dead. The 8 legions they commanded were now leaderless, and he, the sickly boy who had contributed little to the fighting, was the only man on the field with imperium, the legal authority to command them. A tragic coincidence, a stroke of incredible fortune. He saw not tragedy, but opportunity. The Senate had intended for the consuls to command him after the battle was won. Now he commanded them. The weapon had just become its own master. The Senate celebrated the victory over Antony, heaping praise upon their fallen consuls, and offering only a minor acknowledgement to the young Caesar. Then they made their fatal miscalculation. Believing the danger from Antony had passed, they ordered Octavian's legions to be handed over to one of Caesar's assassins, Decimus Brutus. They believed their pawn would now obediently return to his box. They had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the game they were playing. Octavian did not send a letter of protest. He sent a message his new legions would understand. He sent them marching on Rome, 8 legions, 40,000 men, heading south. The act was unthinkable, a sacrilege against the very foundation of the Republic. The city was thrown into a panic. Senators who had days earlier dismissed him as a boy now trembled at the news of his approach. A delegation was sent, pleading with him, reminding him of his duty. They found him not angry or impassioned, but cold, quiet, and implacable. He had a simple demand: the consulship. The Senate chambers were a scene of quiet terror. The senators, men who had governed the known world, now faced the unyielding will of a 19-year-old backed by 40,000 swords. There was no debate. There was no vote. There was only acquiescence. Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, who was too young to even be a senator, was declared consul of Rome. He walked into the Curia Hostilia, the man who had been an outlaw, a tool, a weapon. He took his seat at the head of the Republic, and looked upon the faces of the senators, the same men who had plotted his demise, who had belittled him, who had tried to use him and discard him. Now they showered him with false praise, their faces masks of fear. He felt no warmth in their adulation, only a profound contempt. This was the Republic they cherished, a fragile stage for cowards and hypocrites, where power was traded in whispers and allegiances shifted with the breeze. It was not a thing to be saved, it was a thing to be broken. Having seized Rome, Octavian knew he could not hold it alone. Antony was regrouping in Gaul. Lepidus, another of Caesar's former generals, controlled the legions in Spain. The Republic was a three-headed beast. And if they fought each other, Caesar's assassins, Brutus and Cassius, who were raising a massive army in the east, would be the only ones to profit. So Octavian, the new consul, did the unthinkable. He extended an olive branch to his mortal enemies. They met on a small island in the middle of a river near Bononia, a patch of neutral ground for a profoundly unnatural alliance. For 3 days, Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus negotiated. There were no pleasantries. It was a conference of predators. They stood for the entire duration, never sitting, distrustful to the last. They divided the world between them, like a carcass. Antony, the senior partner, would take the rich east. Lepidus, the weakest, would be content with Africa. Octavian was left with the troublesome west, Rome and Italy, racked by famine, dissent, and the pirate fleets of Sextus Pompey. It seemed the lesser prize, but Octavian knew he who holds Rome holds the heart of the world. With the world carved up, they sealed their pact with the creation of the Second Triumvirate, a legal 5-year dictatorship. Their first official act was to draft a new list of enemies. The proscriptions turned Rome into a charnel house. It was a cold, systematic slaughter, not for justice but for money and revenge. The triumvirs needed to pay their legions and eliminate any political opposition. Lists were posted daily in the forum, condemning hundreds of wealthy senators and equestrians to death, their property forfeit to the state. Fear was a frost settling over the city. Old friends betrayed one another. Families were torn apart. Octavian sat in his study, reviewing the lists. His eyes found the name Marcus Tullius Cicero, the voice of the Republic, the man who had championed him, intending to use him And for all his golden words, for all his philosophy, he was now just ink on a list. His death, a simple transaction to seal a pact with Antony, who hated him. Octavian felt a cold clarity settle over him. Words did not end wars. Laws did not stop assassins. Only power, absolute and unflinching, could bring order. This bloodshed was not merely a purge. It was a lesson he would never forget. The great orator was hunted down and killed, his head and hands displayed on the very rostra from which he had so eloquently spoken. Octavian, his one-time protégé, had consented to his death. It was a necessary price. The old republic, the one Cicero had died for, was already a ghost. At Philippi, the final reckoning against Caesar's assassins, the contrast between the two primary triumvirs, was laid bare. Antony was in his element, a force of nature. His camp was filled with the easy confidence of a warrior king, the boisterous laughter of his men echoing his own. He was the fire of the army, striding among his soldiers, sharing their jokes, his presence a promise of victory. Octavian's camp was a place of quiet anxiety. He was struck again by a bout of debilitating illness, confined to his tent, his face pale and drawn. He was the ice, a cold, calculating mind, trapped in a frail vessel, forced to watch from the periphery. His men fought for the name Caesar, but it was Antony they looked to with adoration. The first battle was Antony's masterpiece. With stunning speed and tactical genius, he smashed through the fortifications of Cassius's army. Cassius, mistakenly believing all was lost, fell on his own sword. It was a brilliant, decisive victory, won almost single-handedly by Antony. Days later, the second battle began. Willis waging gattage of Brutus' wine force, a wing of Brutus' army, broke through Octavian's lines and stormed his camp. They tore through the Praetorian tents, seeking the young Caesar, but found his couch empty. He had been warned in a dream, his apologists would later claim, and had withdrawn just before the attack. Whatever the reason, he was absent from his own defeat. His legions were routed, his camp plundered. It was a moment of profound personal humiliation. He had been proven a liability, a non-entity on the field of battle. The victory was once again secured by Antony, who finally defeated Brutus's army and drove the last of the assassins to suicide. In the aftermath, the glory was all Antony's. He stood over the body of Brutus, momentarily gracious in victory, but his contempt for his young colleague was palpable. He never let Octavian forget who had truly won the day. While you were recovering from your fatigues, Antony would say with a smirk, "I was busy finishing our war." Octavian offered no reply. He knew his own strength did not lie in the heat of battle, but in the cold, patient darkness that would follow. The war against the assassins was over. The war for Rome was just beginning. With the assassins defeated, Antony turned his eyes to the spoils of his victory. The East, it was a world of ancient kingdoms and unimaginable wealth, a world waiting for a new master to consolidate his power and raise funds for a planned invasion of Parthia. He summoned the client rulers of the region to Tarsus in Cilicia. Among them was the Queen of Egypt, Cleopatra. She was accused of having aided Cassius, a charge that could cost her the throne and her life. She did not arrive as a frightened vassal. She sailed up the Cydnus River in a magnificent barge with a gilded stern and purple sails, its silver oarsmen rowing to the music of flutes and lyres. She herself was dressed as Venus, the goddess of love, reclining under a canopy of gold cloth, fanned by boys dressed as cupids. It was a masterful piece of theatre, designed to awe and disarm. When she invited Antony, the conqueror of the world, to a banquet aboard her barge, he found himself the one being summoned. He came and met a woman who was not merely beautiful, but a formidable intellectual who could converse with him in multiple languages, her wit as sharp as her ambition. She was not a prize of war, she was a power in her own right. Antony, a man susceptible to grand gestures and grander passions, was utterly captivated. He followed her to Alexandria for the winter of 41 BC. Here he stepped out of history and into myth. He cast off the heavy wool toga of a Roman magistrate for the fine linens of an Eastern potentate. The days were spent in languid pleasure, the nights in extravagant revelry. He and Cleopatra formed a private society they called the Inimitable Livers, competing to find new and more decadent delights. For Antony, this was more than a dalliance, it was a release. In Rome, power was a constant vicious struggle. Here in Alexandria, power was absolute, unquestioned, and drenched in wine and perfume. He was not merely a guest, he was a king, and the life fit him like a glove. The fire of his personality, so often constrained by Roman austerity, now burned with an unchecked furious blaze. While Antony feasted, Octavian starved. Italy was in the grip of famine, its sea lanes terrorized by Sextus Pompey's pirate fleet. The land was overrun with tens of thousands of demobilized soldiers, all demanding the land and pay they had been promised. Octavian's life was a litany of tedious, unglamorous problems, negotiating grain shipments, confiscating land, putting down riots, raising taxes. He worked relentlessly, his face growing thinner, his demeanor colder. He was surrounded by petitioners, not sycophants. He was building a state while Antony was indulging in a fantasy. The people of Italy saw Antony's decadence and Octavian's diligence. They saw one man abandoning his duties for a foreign queen, and another, however ruthless, working to restore order. Slowly, quietly, the ice was spreading, hardening the ground beneath his feet. The peace could not last. Antony's ambitious wife, Fulvia, and his brother Lucius instigated a war against Octavian in Italy, a misguided attempt to reclaim power for him. After Octavian crushed the rebellion at Perusia, the rift between the two triumvirs was complete. Civil war seemed inevitable. Their legions, however, tired of fighting each other, refused to engage. At the port of Brundisium, the armies forced their leaders to the negotiating table. The atmosphere was thick with resentment. Antony, the glorious general, blamed Octavian for the strife. Octavian, the tireless administrator, blamed Antony for neglecting his responsibilities. It was a tense, bitter summit between two men who now openly despised each other. A solution was proposed, a classic Roman remedy to seal a political pact, marriage. Antony, now a widower after Fulvia's convenient death from illness, would marry Octavian's elder sister, Octavia. She was the ideal Roman matron, beautiful, dignified, and respected by all. For Antony, it was a political necessity. to regain his footing in Italy. For Octavian, it was a strategic masterstroke. He was sacrificing his own sister, placing her in the bed of a man he knew to be faithless, a man whose heart was in Alexandria. He watched his sister, a portrait of Roman dignity, accept her fate for the good of Rome. Some would call this a sacrifice of honor, but honor was a luxury of the past, a currency of a bankrupt republic. In this new world, there was only survival, and survival required not honor, but the willingness to trade anything, even a sister, for time. It was not cruelty, in his cold estimation, it was necessity. The peace was a fragile veneer. Antony lingered in Rome for a time, playing the part of the reconciled triumvir, but his heart was elsewhere. The memory of Alexandria was a constant pull. Rome felt grey and tedious in comparison. He made his decision, citing the need to prepare for his war against Parthia. He left Italy. He sailed not with his new wife, but alone. He was turning his back on Rome, and everyone knew it. Octavia remained in her husband's house in Rome, a paragon of Roman virtue. She raised her own children alongside Antony's children by his former wife, Fulvia, treating them all with equal grace and affection. She was the perfect wife, embodying the dignity and loyalty that Romans prized. Her quiet suffering became a powerful, unspoken rebuke to her absent husband. In the forum and in the bathhouses, people spoke of her with reverence and of Antony with growing disdain. Octavia, in her patient endurance, became one of her brother's most potent political assets. She was the living embodiment of Roman tradition, a stark contrast to the foreign queen who had bewitched her husband. For a few years, a semblance of stability held, but Antony, now back in the orbit of Cleopatra, was a changed man. He finally sent word to Rome, a curt dispatch delivered to Octavian. He was divorcing Octavian. The news was a profound public and private insult, but when Octavian addressed the Senate, there was no fire in his speech, only a carefully constructed sorrow. He spoke of his sister's dignity, her unwavering loyalty, and the dishonor she had suffered. He did not rage against Antony the rival. He lamented for Antony the Roman, a great man lost to the decadent charms of an Eastern sorceress. He transformed a personal slight into a national grievance. The people of Rome, who revered Octavia, were outraged on her behalf. Antony's reputation in Italy was shattered. Then came the act of ultimate political folly. After a successful, if not spectacular, campaign in Armenia, Antony staged a bizarre triumphal procession, not in Rome, but through the streets of Alexandria. At its climax, in the city's gymnasium, he and Cleopatra sat upon golden thrones. He proclaimed her Queen of Kings. He then distributed the eastern territories of the Roman Republic, Cyprus, Libya, Syria, as kingdoms for the children he had with her. But the final, fatal declaration was the most direct attack. He proclaimed Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, to be Caesar's true and legitimate heir. It was a direct repudiation of Octavian's own adoption, the very foundation of his power and name. In one spectacular, arrogant ceremony, Antony had declared himself an Eastern monarch and declared war on his rival's legitimacy. A courier, riding day and night, brought the news to Rome. An aide read the report to Octavian in his study on the Palatine Hill. The aide's voice trembled with outrage as he recounted the details of the ceremony. Octavian listened, his face a mask of calm. When the report was finished, a long silence filled the room. The aide expected an explosion of fury, a call to arms. Instead, he saw a slow, cold smile spread across Octavian's face. It was not a smile of mirth, but of profound, chilling satisfaction. It was the expression of a patient predator who had watched his prey exhaust itself with pointless displays before finally making the one fatal misstep. The game was over. Antony had just handed him the sword with which to cut his throat. With the justification he needed, Octavian unleashed a propaganda war of unprecedented scale and viciousness. Rome became a canvas for his carefully crafted narratives. Overnight, graffiti appeared on walls depicting Antony as a drunken puppet, his strings pulled by Cleopatra. Scrolls circulated, filled with lurid tales of Eastern debauchery and Antony's enslavement to a foreign sorceress. In the Senate, in Dundee, Octavian's allies whispered of treason, painting Antony not as a misguided Roman, but as an enemy of Rome itself. He was no longer Antony. He was the consort of the Egyptian queen, a man who had abandoned his heritage for a throne of gold and silk. The campaign was relentless, poisoning the well of public opinion, until the very name of Antony became synonymous with betrayal. The masterstroke was yet to come. Octavian knew that rumors and stories were not enough. He needed irrefutable proof. He needed Antony's will. The document was sacredly entrusted to the Vestal virgins, its contents protected by the sanctity of the gods themselves. To violate the temple of Vesta was an act of profound sacrilege. It was a line no Roman politician had ever dared to cross. Octavian crossed it. He did not go himself. His men, loyal and ruthless, entered the temple, not with the overt violence of a mob, but with the quiet intimidation of state power. They did not harm the priestesses. They simply made it clear that refusal was not an option. The Vestals, terrified, surrendered the sealed document. The will of Mark Antony was now in the hands of his greatest enemy. Octavian walked into the Senate, the stolen scroll in his hand. The chamber fell silent. He broke the seal and read the contents aloud. The words fell like hammer blows on the assembled senators. Antony affirmed his marriage to Cleopatra. He acknowledged their children as his legal heirs, but the final two clauses were the ones that sealed his fate. He bequeathed large Roman territories to those children, and most damningly, he requested that upon his death, his body should be sent to Alexandria to be buried beside his queen. A wave of shock and fury swept through the Senate. It was one thing to be ruled by a despot, but another entirely to be ruled by one who wished to be buried in foreign soil. It was the ultimate betrayal, a symbolic rejection of his very Roman identity. This was the proof Octavian had so patiently waited for. Antony had, with his own words, declared himself an alien. The Senate, incensed and manipulated, did exactly as Octavian had planned. They stripped Antony of all his powers and declared war. But to avoid the stain of another civil war, They declared it not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. The conflict was no longer a struggle between two Romans. It was a righteous war against a foreign enemy and her puppet general. As Rome prepared for the final war, Octavian made his most astute military decision. He would not command the fleet himself. He was not a general, and he knew it. The humiliation at Philippi had taught him that lesson well. Personal glory was a vanity he could not afford. Victory was all that mattered. He summoned his closest friend, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, a military genius of the highest order. In a quiet meeting, away from the pomp and ceremony, Octavian formally handed supreme command of the armed forces to him. "You win the battles," Octavian told him, his voice devoid of emotion. "I will win the war." It was the ultimate act of his cold, pragmatic leadership. The ice had delegated the fire. The Bay of Actium shimmered under the late summer sun. The combined fleets of Antony and Cleopatra arrayed in a formidable crescent. They possessed larger ships, more soldiers, and in Antony one of the greatest generals of the age. But his camp was a place of discord. His Roman commanders, proud and experienced men, chafed at the presence of the Egyptian queen in their war council. They argued for a land battle where Antony's legions excelled, but Cleopatra, fearing she could be cut off, insisted on the sea. Antony, torn between his military sense and his devotion to her, equivocated, and his indecision sowed dissent through the ranks. In contrast, Octavian's camp, managed by the ruthlessly efficient Agrippa, was a model of order. Their ships were smaller, lighter, and more maneuverable, designed not for boarding but for swift ramming attacks. The strategy was clear, the chain of command undisputed. On the day of the battle, Octavian was a passenger on his own flagship, the outcome of the war resting entirely on the brilliance of the friend he had trusted to win it for him. The battle began. Antony's massive quinqueremes, like floating fortresses, were powerful but slow. Agrippa's smaller Liburnian galleys moved like wolves circling a herd of buffalo. They darted in, smashed their bronze rams into the heavy oars of Antony's ships, and retreated before the legionaries aboard could respond. The larger ships were rendered immobile, their power useless. The sea became a chaotic mass of splintered wood and drowning men. Still, Antony's fleet was vast, and the fight was far from decided. Then the inexplicable happened. A squadron of 60 Egyptian ships, with Cleopatra's flagship at its center, suddenly hoisted its sails and broke from the battle line, heading south. It was not a retreat under pressure. It was a clean, deliberate departure. The Roman commanders watched in stunned disbelief, but their shock turned to horror when they saw Antony's flagship follow suit. Mark Antony, the man who had shared every hardship with his soldiers, the general beloved for his courage, was abandoning them in the thick of the fight. He transferred to a smaller, faster ship and chased after the fleeing queen, leaving his men, his honor, and his world behind. The sight of their commander deserting them broke the back of Antony's forces. For a time they fought on, out of loyalty or sheer disbelief. But with no leader and no hope of victory, the spirit drained from them. One by one, then in squadrons, the great ships surrendered. By nightfall, the once mighty fleet was entirely in Agrippa's hands. On the shore, Antony's legions, who had watched the disaster unfold, waited for 7 days, hoping their general would return. He never did. They too surrendered. Octavian had won. It was not a glorious victory, filled with heroic charges. It was a quiet, total, and inevitable result. The fire had extinguished itself. As Octavian's legions advanced on Alexandria, Antony made one last attempt to rally the troops that remained to him. He rode out to meet them, but the men who had once worshipped him now refused his command. They had not betrayed him. He had betrayed them first at Actium. They melted away, deserting to Octavian's side without a fight, broken and utterly alone. Antony returned to the palace. It was there that a messenger, sent by Cleopatra in a misguided attempt to protect herself, brought the final, false report. The queen was dead. She had taken her own life. The news broke what little was left of him, with no army, no honor, and now no Cleopatra. His world was empty. "I will not be long in joining you," he whispered to the empty air. He called for his most loyal servant, Eros, to kill him. But Eros, unable to strike his master, killed himself instead, shamed and inspired by the act. Antony drew his own sword and fell upon it, but the blow was clumsy, ill-aimed. It was not a clean death. The blade slid past his vital organs, leaving him mortally wounded, bleeding and in agony, but still alive. He had lived a life of magnificent triumphs, but his end was a pathetic, drawn-out failure. His servants carried the dying general to the mausoleum where Cleopatra had sealed herself. Hoisted up by ropes, he was brought through a high window into her arms. He died there, cradled by the woman for whom he had thrown away the world. His last breath a whisper of her name. Octavian's soldiers took Cleopatra alive. She was brought before the young conqueror, her queenly regalia gone, but her pride intact. But worry, Aintusi made regent Ories, but of wills. Octavian was cold, courteous, his words promising mercy, but his eyes were chips of flint, and Cleopatra, a student of power her entire life, knew his true intention. He did not want her dead. He wanted her alive, a living trophy, to be paraded in chains through the streets of Rome during his triumph. It would be the ultimate symbol of his victory. The great Queen of Egypt, the seductress of Caesar and Antony, reduced to his captive. Cleopatra would not grant him that satisfaction. She played her part, feigning submission, seeming to accept her fate, but secretly she made her preparations. A basket of figs was delivered to her chambers, a simple meal for a captive. Hidden beneath the fruit were asps, the small, deadly serpents of the Nile, dressed in her finest royal robes. She wrote a final letter to Octavian, requesting to be buried beside Antony. When Octavian's guards, alerted by the letter's tone, broke down her door, they found her dead upon her golden couch, a peaceful expression on her face, 2 small puncture marks on her arm. She had died a queen. In her final act, she had denied her conqueror his prize and claimed the only victory left to her. Octavian stood over the body of the dead queen. He felt a flicker of frustration, a resentment that she had denied him his final, perfect spectacle. But the feeling passed as quickly as it came, replaced by the cold, clear logic of his ambition. Her death solved a problem. A living Cleopatra would have been a constant source of fascination and potential rebellion. A dead one was merely a story. There was, however, one last loose end. "Find the boy," he said to his guards, his voice flat. "Find Caesarin and finish it." There could not be two sons of Caesar in the world. He returned to Rome, the undisputed master of a world weary of war. The Senate, now a compliant instrument of his will, showered him with honors. They named him Augustus, the revered one. The doors of the temple of Janus, which stood open in times of war, were closed for the first time in 2 centuries. An era of peace, the Pax Romana, had begun. The triumph he celebrated was the most magnificent Rome had ever seen. For 3 days, a river of captured wealth, exotic animals, and chained prisoners flowed through the city streets. The crowds roared, hailing him as a savior, the man who had ended a century of civil war. On the final day, the climax of the procession was dedicated to the conquest of Egypt. An effigy of Queen Cleopatra, depicted with the asp at her arm, was carried on a lavish litter. The crowd stared in awe at the image of the woman who had captivated 2 of the greatest Romans of their age, and had nearly brought the Republic to its knees. It was a stunning display, a masterpiece of political theatre, but it was a hollow one. The greatest prize had eluded him. The celebrations ended, the crowds dispersed, the noise faded. Augustus, once Octavian, stood alone in a vast, silent hall of his new palace on the Palatine Hill. Marble floors gleamed under the moonlight, reflecting his solitary figure. He had done it. He had avenged his father. He had destroyed all his enemies. He had brought peace and order to a broken world. He had won everything. The fire of Antony's passion, the fire of Cleopatra's ambition, the fires of rebellion and civil war, all had been extinguished, and in the process, the last embers of fire within himself had died too. The boy who had gambled for a legacy in Apollonia was gone. The man who had wept for his sister was a ghost. All that remained was Augustus, not a man, but an institution, a principle, the cold, enduring, and utterly lonely embodiment of power, the price of peace.